You're listening to Packers Talk Network.
PackersTalk.com. Do you want to experience the thrill of a Packers game at Lambeau Field? If so, be sure to get your guaranteed authentic tickets from theticketking.com, a longtime trusted source and local Green Bay business. Just go to PackersTalk.com/tickets for more information and ticket links. That's PackersTalk.com/tickets.
Welcome to the Packers Weekly Podcast. You got yourself a spontaneous live stream here tonight. Won't call it an emergency pod, but it is a bit spontaneous, a bit urgent in the light of the Joe Barry news. So we are diehard Packers fans coming at you weekly usually. Now for the second time this week. We're not getting into the national sports media talking points. We're getting into real football. I am your host, Miles Teddick, joined by your co-host, Tim Hamilton, and we are here to have some fun tonight. Quick stream. We're not going to make it long tonight. We're going to stop at 9:30 and actually hop over on another podcast where we'll be talking more Packers and representing the Packers Weekly Podcast well. But we wanted to get in tonight and get some reactions to the Joe Barry news. So if you would support the podcast, spike that like button, follow us, subscribe, all that on all the socials. It only takes you a second and costs you nothing, but it goes a long way for us. So, Tim, sir, initial reactions. Joe Barry is no longer the defensive coordinator for the Green Bay Packers.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it the other night that we weren't sure if this was going to happen or not. We certainly thought it should happen. But we, obviously didn't know what LaFleur was going to decide to do because he's been hesitant, obviously, in the past to make a move when it seems obvious to so many other people that he should be making the move. I held on to him for the third season. He's continued to defend him all along. So wasn't sure that he was actually going to go through with it, but obviously he did. And I'm not going to celebrate somebody losing their job and being fired because obviously that's a human there besides just being a football coach. He's a person and it affects a family and everything like that. So we don't want to celebrate that and wish him the best going forward. But it was the right decision. 1,000%. It was the right decision. It was something that had to be done. And I'm glad Matt LaFleur went through with it. And he gave him 3 years, which is plenty of time for it to work out and to see the plan through. And it wasn't working. They needed a change. Nothing was getting better. And continuing along with Joe Barry into a fourth year, nothing was going to get better. It was just going to be more of the same. So I'm glad LaFleur looked, beyond just knowing that Joe Barry's a good guy. He's a friend of Matt's. He wanted to make it work so badly with him, but he did something for the greater good of the Packers, it's what his job is as the head coach. So he made the tough choice, and I think it's obviously a step in the right direction. And, I'm very optimistic as far as what their defense can now be in the future. Hopefully he gets the hire right. Of course, we want that. It goes without saying. But I expect improvement, and I'm hoping whoever the next person is can make better use of their personnel, can use the guys to the best of their ability, and have a defense that can be multiple, that can be aggressive, that can finally dictate to an offense and can change itself based on the opponent, and then in game based on what the opponent is doing or based on what's working, what's not working. It's time for a more modernized, a more flexible, and a more multiple, aggressive, physical defense.
Yeah, man. I'm hoping for all of the above. And I think it's important to emphasize what you said about, the human side of this thing.
Yeah.
And from everything that we've heard, Joe Barry is like as good as a man gets in this world these days. He sounds like, just the most upstanding of gentlemen. So we are not here to dance on graves or to celebrate a good man losing his job. We are certainly here as Packers fans interested in who would come next and excited, I think, at the prospect that, it's unfortunate, but Joe Barry's not the right guy for the job. And I don't think that's not celebrating anything. That's just being cold and honest. We've got the body of work, 3 seasons, not bad. He had some good moments. There were some, it came down to the end and everybody was kind of split on the decision. Is he going to stay? Is he going to go? That means he wasn't the worst defensive coordinator you could ask for, right? I mean, it definitely could have been worse. He's just not the right guy for the job. There's a lot. It seems like this offseason specifically, there's a lot more defensive coordinator candidates out there. Some that probably aren't, right? Like they're probably head coach guys, but there's a lot of names out there right now. And so it's very, very hard to justify Joe Barry being the best guy for the job at this point. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's where we're at, right? So, farewell, good sir. Thank you for the good points and the things that he did contribute to the Green Bay Packers, because there were definitely some good defensive performances that we got to enjoy under his watch. And so appreciate his work, appreciate his effort and everything he did. But good luck to you, sir. All the best. And, man, now who's it going to be, right? I mean, Tim, lead us off here. Like I think we're chomping at the bit to bring up a list of candidates. And I've got one that I'm wondering if you're going to bring it up. So lead us off here, sir.
So I think you can look at it in like a few different ways, a couple different buckets. And that's guys that LaFleur previously interviewed when he interviewed Joe Barry and chose Joe Barry. Start with Giro Evero, who's the Carolina Panthers defensive coordinator. Don't know if he's going to become available because he has head coaching interviews and he's getting second interviews with teams. So he may very well get a head coaching interview. If not, he may be available, or whoever comes in the Carolina's head coaching job may want to keep him. So that might take some time to see if he's actually going to be a candidate. But I think somebody that LaFleur would go back to, because the rumor was it was between him and Joe Barry, and they went with Joe Barry because Joe Barry had more experience at the time. Well, now Evero's had the experience, 2 years as defensive coordinator. His defenses have been pretty good without any help from the offenses. So he was in Denver in 22. They were a dumpster fire of an offense, terrible offense. The head coaching situation with Nate Hackett was awful. But the defense was pretty solid, did a good job. Carolina, again, did a pretty decent job with a terrible offense on the other side of the ball. So it was kind of all on the defense. Could he be better? Yeah, the numbers could be better. The stats could be better. Absolutely. But there's a lot of positives to that. The fact that all these teams, he interviewed a couple different spots last year for head coaching jobs. He's in at least 3 different spots this year for head coaching jobs. Teams around the league see that this guy's an up-and-coming coordinator. LaFleur has experience with him too, which, we know LaFleur likes to look at that. They coached together with the Rams. Evero was a quality control guy under Dom Capers with the Packers. Went to the Rams. He was under Wade Phillips. He was under Brandon Staley. So he's got a different background. He's not going to be, running. He may run similar things to what Barry ran just because of the Brandon Staley background, but because he's under was under Capers, was under Wade Phillips, he has a more diverse background too. So I would think if LaFleur can talk to him, he's going to be at the top of the list. And LaFleur's talked, when they played the Panthers this year, he talked very highly of him. So I think there's a lot of respect there. And I think he would be somebody that Matt would definitely interview. There's also another name, Chris Harris, who was part of that interview process the first time. He's the defensive backs coach with Tennessee. At the time, he was with the Commanders as their defensive backs coach. He's had a couple other DC interviews over the last couple of years. LaFleur could go back there. It was rumored that he had a great interview the first time around with the Packers. I would think the LaFleur may look in that direction as well. And then there's Jim Leonhard, who a lot of Packer fans have been talking about since he interviewed the first time. And ever since then, anytime there's been issues with Joe Barry, Jim Leonhard's name always gets brought up. We know that he supposedly turned LaFleur down the first time. So would LaFleur go back to him now after being turned down before? I don't know. That's tricky. But if LaFleur really wants him, now's probably a better time to get him, because the first time Leonhard didn't want to come because he thought that he was going to be a lifetime Wisconsin coach and eventually get that head coaching job. Well, all that's out the window because they went to Luke Fickell. So Leonhard's out there, and it would be interesting if LaFleur goes that route again, since he was turned down the first time. But if If he was really that impressed with him before and that interested in him before, I could see it happening. So that's kind of like the group that he interviewed the first time. And then I think there's another group of guys that he may look at that he has a background with, and that guys that friends of his have a background with. So Sean McVay, Robert Salo, those kind of guys that he can talk to for references. So that would be Marquand Manuel will be one guy, coached with him in Atlanta, former Packers safety. But LaFleur knows him from on the same staff in Atlanta. He's worked under Robert Saleh for the last couple of years with the Jets. They've had a really good defense. As bad as the offense has been, their defense has been damn good. Obviously, he could go to Saleh, who's his best buddy, get a recommendation there. I would think he's going to be on the list of candidates for sure. Another name, and this is kind of a Packers Twitter controversial one, is Brandon Staley, who LaFleur doesn't have a direct tie with, but he worked under Sean McVay, who obviously LaFleur is very close with. Staley loved him. They were only together for 1 year, but Staley has raved about him since then. Had a very good defense for his 1 year as a coordinator with the Rams, but he also had Aaron Donald and Jalen Ramsey in the prime of their careers. Went to the Chargers as their head coach. Their defenses stunk. And he was in charge of those defenses. He called the defense. Wasn't very good. So the question becomes like, will he be better as a coordinator now that he doesn't have to worry about all the head coaching stuff and he can just focus on being a coordinator? I don't know. And the defense that he would bring would be very similar to what Joe Barry just brought, because Joe Barry learned that defense from Brandon Staley in their year together with the Rams. So not sure I would be real happy about that hire, but I could see LaFleur potentially looking at him. Now, there was a report today from Rob Demoski saying that Staley won't be a candidate. So maybe that's the fact and we can forget about that. But I could see LaFleur looking into him and possibly interviewing. I could see him being a candidate. So those are some guys that he's interviewed, talked to before, or he has ties to. We can go down a list. I think there's some other candidates that have been thrown out there that maybe he doesn't have a direct tie with or hasn't coached with directly, but could certainly see him bringing in. Everybody in Packers Twitter loves Al Harris because he was a Packer and he was a really good Packer. He's done a good job with the Cowboys cornerbacks. Also has a background, Steve Spagnuolo, because he was on the Chiefs staff previously to go into Dallas. I could see it. He's just been a position coach. So, like, what would he do for an entire defensive structure? Like, how would he coach it? What would his scheme be? Not sure he's quite ready for this step yet, but I could see it appealing to LaFleur. I mean, he would be an aggressive coach for sure, because that's how he played and that's how he coaches his DBs. Might be somebody he looks at. Plus, he's under Dan Quinn. Matt LaFleur coached under Dan Quinn. So LaFleur could go to Dan Quinn too. Who's guys that you like, Dan? Like, what's your recommendation on Al Harris? So that could be a tie there. Joe Witt Jr. is also on that Dallas staff. And you and I have talked about Joe Witt Jr. before. Longtime Packers assistant. Did a great job. Charles Woodson raved about him. Sam Shields, when he was here, raved about him. Like, players loved him. It's really surprising he hasn't gotten a defensive coordinator job yet. I just don't think LaFleur would probably interview him. I think he would be a great candidate. I think he'd be tremendous to talk to and potentially for that role. But when LaFleur was hired, he had the chance to keep him on staff, and he didn't. Now, that could have been Joe Witt wanting to move on, but it seems like it was more LaFleur wanting to go in a different direction, because Mike Pettin was still the coordinator. Mike Pettin wanted him and kind of made that clear.
Yeah.
So if LaFleur didn't want him in 2019, is LaFleur going to want him now? Wouldn't think so, but you never know. I mean, he may look at him and say, look, he worked with Dan Quinn. Look at the success of the Cowboys defense. He's had more experience. Maybe that's somebody. He would be on my list. I kind of don't think he'll be on LaFleur's, but it's a name to keep out there. Patrick Graham, Raiders defensive coordinator. He was a former Packer coach. He was only here for 1 year in 2018. And then when LaFleur took over, LaFleur wasn't able to keep him because he went and got a defensive coordinator's job with the Dolphins. He's been around a little bit, Dolphins, Giants, and now the Raiders. But second half of the year with the Raiders, their defense was really good. It improved when they fired the head coach, Josh McDaniels, for whatever reason. Whatever changes Graham made, it really improved the defense the second half of the year. Don't know if he'll even be available. He's had head coaching interviews, and I would think they're going to keep him as the defensive coordinator with the Raiders. But if he's out there and they're not going to keep him, I think he's worth talking to. Um, and then there's just some other names that, in kind of my opinion on who they should be looking for, and not necessarily who LaFleur may talk to, but who I think they should talk to. I would look to the Baltimore Ravens defensive staff, and we've mentioned this before in the podcast too, talking about Joe Barry. Like, that's a scheme and a team that it's not just this year where they've been the top defense and been successful. Like, it's year after year where they're pretty consistent on defense. Like, and you think about the Ravens, it's Lamar Jackson, but it's a big physical defense. You think of a defensive football team, and they've done it through different coordinators. Wink Martindale was there before, and him and Harbaugh had a falling out. He left. Mike McDonald took over, and they've been very good in 2 years with Mike McDonald. It's a proven scheme. Mike McDonald spent a year at Michigan, had a really good defense. So I would look to his staff. There's several guys there. Chris Hewitt, Denard Wilson. Denard Wilson was a former Eagles assistant who was up for their coordinator job last year and got passed over. So he went to Baltimore and coached the defensive backs this year. Hewitt's a defensive backs coach and passing game coordinator. He's been with the Ravens for several years. Those guys, I mean, if it was me, I would definitely bring him in. LaFleur doesn't have ties to these guys, though. He doesn't have ties to the Baltimore staff, so don't know if they would be on his radar. Milt Hendrickson, who's one of Brian Gutekunst's personnel guys, came from Baltimore, though. So he may have some kind of background with some of these guys, or be able to, reach out and get feedback on them. Maybe he can be that go-between for LaFleur. But, I mean, if LaFleur is looking at defenses that have had success, not just this year, but over several years, Baltimore should be one of them, and he should be looking at their staff. So it would be Denard Wilson. It would be Chris Hewitt. It would be Anthony Weaver, who is a former defensive coordinator. He was in Houston. He has a background with Rex Ryan from playing under him and coaching under him, too. He's their D-line coach. He's had a few head coaching interviews, too. And then they also have a younger inside linebackers coach named Zach Orr, who's new to coaching the last several years, but he was a player for them, too. So they have several guys. And then just to throw out some other names that have been out there. So Jesse Minter, who is part of that Ravens coaching tree, came up through the Ravens, but the last 2 years he's been the defensive coordinator with Michigan. Obviously, they just won a national championship. They've had one of the best defenses in college football. But he came up through Baltimore. He learned that system before he went into college. Don't know if he's going to be available. He may very well be going with Jim Harbaugh to the Chargers now. But he would certainly be on my list again, because he's got that Raven coaching tree, could bring in the similar system, and I think would be just tremendous. I think they're kind of like on the new cutting edge wave of like, this is the kind of offense that you now need to combat the kind of defense that you need to combat the offenses that we're seeing. Wink Martindale's name's been brought up a lot. I know Packer fans love him. He's had success, but he's also now left his last two jobs, Ravens and Giants, because he's had issues with the head coaches there. I don't see personality-wise and that kind of history meshing with LaFleur. Like, Wink Martindale is going to come in and run his defense, and he's going to blitz the hell out of everybody. He's not going to change. He's going to be his own self, and you're not going to be able to go and tell him, like, Wink, I want you to do this, or Wink, why don't – like, he's his own guy. And he's had success as a coordinator. He's a good coordinator, but I don't see LaFleur hiring a dude that has been let go his last two spots because him and the head coach have clashed. Like, it kind of sets up a pattern. But he's a guy to look at. And just to throw a couple other names out there, I like the Chiefs defense, like what they've done under Spagnuolo. They've brought in a bunch of young players the last couple of years and developed them. And everybody thinks of Mahomes with the Chiefs and the offense and how great they've been. Their defense has been the better unit this year and a more consistent unit. And they're playing with, yes, they have Chris Jones, who's a stud, but they got a lot of young defensive backs, especially at corner. They've brought in a lot of young players over the last couple of years and built that defense up and developed those guys. There's a defensive backs coach on that staff who's been under Spagnuolo for a while now, Dave Merritt. I think he deserves at least an interview, at least, to see what he's about and what he could bring if he could, because I like that scheme and I like the results they've gotten. And then just quickly throwing a couple of names out there. I don't think he'll go the college route, but if he did, Georgia's defensive coordinator, Glenn Schumann, who's been under Kirby Smart. We know the Packers have taken 3 Georgia defenders in the first round. They develop draft picks. I mean, a lot of these guys are coming in as 4 and 5 star guys, but you still have to develop them, and they're making them first round picks. Kirby Smart's been a great defensive coordinator previous to Georgia at Alabama. Be kind of a wild card, a dark horse candidate, but he did interview with the Eagles last year for their spot. Maybe look at it. And then if you're looking at, I kind of always like the 49ers, and they've been consistent under Saleh, then DeMeco Ryans, and now Steve Wilks. Like, the system works. They have a defensive backs coach there, Daniel Bullocks, who's been there for several years. And they've had a lot of injuries, a lot of moving parts in their secondary, but he's part of a defense that's been very successful. And like I said, through multiple coordinators, multiple changes there, might be somebody you want to look at as well. So I know it's a long list on a lot of people, but just to throw some names out there, some ideas. I think ultimately Matt LaFleur is going to choose somebody he's either previously worked with or interviewed prior, or maybe somebody who works under Saleh or has a connection, and he'll go to one of his buddies and say, who do you know? Who do you like? And it may start that way for his connection. I would love somebody personally from the Ravens coaching tree, but I just don't see the connections there. Maybe he'll surprise me and go outside his comfort zone and hire somebody he doesn't have that background with. It's possible, but yeah, it's kind of where I'm at right now with who I think he may look at and what he may do going forward.
The theme seems to be either kind of the old guard, the Wink Martindale, the Vic Fangios, or some of the up and comers, and then that's kind of divided into who's related to LaFleur and who's not.
Yeah.
I have a hard time guessing what he will do on this one. I think some things are easier to predict. Like we were talking about the Barry firing, this was pretty easy to predict. And there's reasons things can be easy to predict. This doesn't seem very easy to predict to me. So when I look at this, I think I lean with you. I don't think he will go in the older guard direction of the Wink Martindale, Vic Fangio type guy. Yeah. But if I were to try to guess who he will go with, it's tough. I think the idea of Jim Leonhard has kind of sailed for me. I loved the guy at Wisconsin.
Yeah, he was great.
And I think he's going to be a great coach. It just doesn't seem like he's the guy. And I'd really rather get somebody who's been an NFL defensive coach. He had a great NFL career, and he did well in college very early, but his college exposure is still pretty limited as far as coaching goes. And so that's where I'm just like, I don't know if Leonard's the guy yet. We'll let somebody else figure that out. For me, the one that would be very interesting, and again, I don't think he goes, college ranks with no NFL experience, but Dave Aranda. And I heard I was going to put him on the list. Tausch, and that's where I was like, man, Dave Aranda, that would be something.
I was going to mention him, but I'm like, will he really leave a head coaching job at Baylor? Even though the last couple of years, I know he's kind of been on the hot seat. They haven't had a whole lot of success. Maybe he's thinking like long term, like if he doesn't win next year, he might be out of a job, so he could take this job.
More stability in the NFL for sure. It was interesting when I heard that. I was like, man, that was out of left field for me, because I've thought about a lot of these guys and who we would want, and I hadn't thought about Dave Aranda. But when I think about Dave Aranda, he is the better version of Jimmy Leonhard to me. The success he had at Wisconsin to me was better than the success that Jimmy Leonhard had at Wisconsin. I think Jimmy Leonhard's success was good, and it was amplified a little bit by him being the hometown hero And again, love me some Jimmy Leonard, but man, when Aranda ran that defense, they were dominant. They didn't give up points to anybody.
Wasn't he that like he was there? It was kind of like unstable. Wasn't he there like Gary Anderson, and then he was there. He stayed for Chris.
Right, he was there for like 3 years, I think, something like that.
Yeah, like so it was a little bit like Leonard probably had better players, right?
Yeah, that would be fair to say. It
Aranda,
was definitely more turbulent with Aranda, and I think that's what made it so impressive because he wasn't working with 4- and 5-star recruits. Now Wisconsin's famous for their walk-ons and all of that.
Yeah, they develop guys.
Man, when Aranda stepped in there, that defense was just dominant, man. And it lasted. He set the tone. He reset the tone of that defense. And I think that really helped Leonard when he stepped in and all that. But, yeah, so Aranda was one I was like, you know what? If you were going to pull from the college ranks without NFL experience, that's a guy I think might be able to do it. Just a fascinating thought. Not to say that I think he's the best guy for the job.
Yeah.
If I had to guess who's the best guy for the job right now, I like the defensive coordinator for the Panthers, Evero.
Yeah.
I can't remember.
Evero, I think you pronounce it. Yeah, Evero.
I need to practice his name, Evero.
I think he might, if he becomes if he doesn't get a head coaching job and they let him out of his contract there, I think he has a really good shot to be the guy.
Well, and based on what LaFleur said about him since he interviewed him before, I mean, it sounded like he was pretty close to hiring him before.
Should have.
Man, well, but yeah, so I mean, you don't know what the opportunities are. Is he available? Is he interested? You just don't know.
Yeah.
And that's why we're all speculation here. But that's the one to me that seems like the best fit. And as far as the connection to LaFleur, it's there from the previous interview. So, yeah, that one would be interesting to me. I would like to see that. Beyond that, man, I think I lean Newgard. I think I'm leaning away from the Fangio, the Wink. I think you want to try to find the McVay-esque or defensive equivalent of the McVay type guy, right? The guy that's just this young, brilliant mind and ready to go take these pieces that this defense has and maximize them because they've got some pieces, man. I mean, I think that's what everybody's able to see, and the biggest criticism of Joe Barry is like, you got all these pieces, dude. You got to be better than average, and you're not. And so you want to see that. Like, what is for me, what's fascinating is to think about, like, what is a guy from the outside looking in going, ooh, man, that Rashawn Gary, that Jair Alexander, that Quay Walker, ooh, I do something. Like, I do that. I want the guy who's got the pistons are firing. You know what I mean? He's out there scheming up all these ways that he could use this guy and that guy. And when he gets in that interview with LaFleur, should blow his socks off. It's like, dude, here's how we're going to use these studs that you got. That's what I want, and I don't know who that is. And I answered, I think I was on Twitter earlier, and somebody was asking, well, what's do you think they should be a 4-3 or 3-4? I'm like, whichever one wins the Super Bowl.
Yeah, it doesn't. I mean, I don't even think that's important anymore. Like, it was important when Capers came, and it was a change before because that's how defense was back then.
Yeah.
But now everybody's playing nickel, and everybody the fronts are really similar. I think it's more like how you're going to use that front. Are you going to move guys around? Are you going to keep the same guys in the same spot every down like Joe Barry did? How are you going to run your coverage? Like, that kind of stuff is way more important than whether it's a 3-4 or 4-3 because you're not going to play much base anyway. So I don't think it matters. I'm not worried.
We will find out, but we are going to cut over to another podcast now. So if you are listening and interested in this conversation, we're going to cut over to the Friesen 4 podcast and continue this conversation on behalf of the Packers Weekly podcast with some Vikings, Bears, and Lions fans. Oh, my. We're going to let them know what the future of the Packers looks like, and we're going to continue this conversation, I would imagine, again this time next week. We'll have our next live stream next Monday. And man, if they fill this role before then, we'll go live again. We'll jump in and we'll start talking again. But if you are joining us right now, we appreciate you. We hope you'll come back. And, as always, go, Pack, go.